Welcome everybody to the online Peace Science Colloquium. This is our final presentation of the semester, and we're really excited today to introduce William Wagstaff, who is the Bremer Award winner for this year. The Bremer Award is given to the best graduate student presentation that's presented in the fall Peace Science annual meeting. So he's already killed it with this presentation once, and we wanted to use the online colloquium forum in order to present that so that more people would have a chance to get a look at it, and then also to offer an opportunity for William to get more feedback on the project. So today we have, and anyone who is interested in the project can go to the online Peace Science Colloquium website. Go to the Peace Science website and go under Colloquium, and you can download the paper and take a look. So we'll have William present today so that everyone can get a chance to see this award-winning presentation, and then we will open it up for comments from our discussants. Today we have Patricia Sullivan, an associate professor at the University of North Carolina. We have Idean, an associate professor from UT Dallas. Toby Ritter, who's also an associate professor at Texas Tech University. And I am trying to get June Koga Sudduth, who's an assistant professor at Strathclyde University, and hopefully we'll be able to get her in. In the meantime, why don't we have William take it away?
Okay, great. Let's go ahead and share my slides. All set?
All set.
All right, great. Well, thanks for that introduction and for organizing, and thanks to all the discussants who are willing to read the paper and provide feedback. I'm really excited about this project, both as a standalone and because I just defended my prospectus recently, a couple weeks ago, that builds on this, and so feedback now is particularly helpful. So a lot to get through in 15 minutes, so let's jump right in. If I can get it to jump right in. So I think about this project as speaking to a number of related literatures and have a number of related research questions. And the first is really about this organizational self-assessment, so thinking about work in public administration or organizational theory, about how organizations can assess themselves and then assess themselves accurately in an effort to adapt or to improve over time. And this, I think, is related to another set of formal work on resolving the principal-agent problem. So the question here is just, when can principals overcome their informational disadvantage as they seek to evaluate agents in an effort to retain competent or hardworking agents? And so previous work has really looked at manipulating contracts or having a supervisor as kind of a middle management. And this paper really looks at allowing the agents to signal about each other. And so the idea here is, when can the signal be trusted? And so when the signal can be trusted, that helps to resolve the information asymmetry. And this actually is related to the first question, in that when principals can assess their personnel, they can then adapt over time and improve. And then I think the fun application is in thinking about how we currently think about military innovation as this top-down major technical advance or these sorts of things. There's also a subset of literature from within the military about how the military promotion process comes about. How effective is it at identifying people who are good at their jobs and promoting them? And so this paper is really looking at a bottom-up adaptation. So the idea is, as opposed to a top-down, this model looks at information transmitted from lower-ranking individuals up the chain of command, and then the military can adapt by responding to these signals that can be trusted. And so just to preview what's to come and set your expectations. So the answer to the first question is remove incompetent management. And so this begs the question of how do you know who's incompetent? And so that's really a two-parter, and it's related to the following two questions. So in resolving the principal-agent problem, so the idea here is you can get a good signal or a trustworthy signal. So when is that possible? And it's really possible only after a good outcome, or when there's a sufficiently low probability that a replacement will be competent. I'll get into the reasoning behind that in a moment. And then that's not enough. It has to also be the case that the principal is willing to respond to a trustworthy signal. And so in addition to having these two conditions, there has to be a sufficiently low cost to firing in order for the principal to then respond. So the question now is, how do we get from A to B? So this paper formulates a formal model that really considers a three-tiered hierarchy. And so I only look really at the active actions of the player at the top, H. So H is high, middle, low, who is the principal, and then L and M are the agents in this scenario. And so H is looking to identify and retain only competent agents, and L is able to signal about M's competency. So the game begins by nature determining the competencies of L and M. So with probability P, they'll be competent. With probability 1 minus P, they'll be incompetent. Nature then determines some sort of outcome, omega, that's a function of these competencies. So 2 competent agents will yield a good outcome with certainty. 2 incompetent agents will yield a poor outcome with certainty. And mixed competency agents will yield a good outcome with probability Q and a poor outcome with probability 1 minus Q. And so you can think about Q as really the ability of agents to overcome their competency deficit through superior technology or numerical superiority on the battlefield, these sorts of things. After this outcome is revealed to all of the players, L, who has now observed her own competency and the competency of her colleague M, has an opportunity to signal the principal concerning her colleague's competence. And the signal here is really L trying to get M fired. It's L's telling the principal, it's the agent telling the principal that you have an incompetent agent, you should fire this agent. After having observed this potential signal or no signal at all, and the outcome, the principal then gets to make a personnel decision about whether or not to retain or fire some subset of the agents. After this decision is made, there's a second outcome, again the same rules as before, and the game ends. The payoff structure is relatively simple. So what the agent really cares about is retaining office, having a competent colleague, and being promoted. And so in the first 2 lines here are the scenarios in which L, the signaler, is retained. So in both scenarios, I guess all 3 of those scenarios, L receives 1. Additionally, if both are retained, L receives an additional U tile if the colleague is competent. You know, positive externalities of having a good supervisor makes your life easier. But also, if L had signaled, so that sigma indicates whether or not L signaled. If sigma equals 1, basically that means L now has to pay some cost for that signal because M was retained. M is now peeved that L tried to go over M's head and try to get M fired, and has considerable influence over resource allocation, mission allocation. And in the future, M may be able to influence the ability of L to be promoted. So there is some cost to signaling. If, however, M is fired, then the agent, the signaler, still gets 1 for retaining office, but additionally gets promoted. So that's what that psi parameter is there to pick up. But once L is promoted in M's position, this leaves a vacancy that L still cares about because it still pays to have a competent colleague. And so that colleague will be competent with probability P. And again, 0 if L is fired. The principal cares about, is concerned about outcomes in the next period. So and again, this is a function of the competencies. So what the principal is trying to do here is identify and retain competent subordinates, competent agents in an effort to ensure a good outcome in the next period. But in order to do so, the principal may have to fire 1 or more of the agents. And so that's that cost C. There's a cost to firing C. And you can think of this as maybe a lag in performance. And this is multiplied by N, which is just the number of agents that are fired. So that could be 0, 1, or 2. And so to think about how to approach solving this model, I really considered it in 2 phases. The first is after a poor outcome, and the second is after a good outcome. So we'll start with the poor outcome. The idea here is that, I guess the bad news is that after a poor outcome, the agent will never reveal any information that will be useful to the principal. And to observe why this is the case, consider the following 3 states, these competency mixes. So note that an underline indicates an incompetent agent, an overbar indicates a competent agent. So the principal, having observed the poor outcome, knows that she is in one of these 3 states. And so we may want to ask the question, for example, is it possible for L to send a truthful signal, which would imply that L only signals in states 1 and in state 3. What this means, however, is that in state 2, by not signaling, L identifies herself as an incompetent agent and therefore is at risk for removal and has an incentive to deviate to pool. And you can work through any 1 or a combination of 2 of these to see that that's the case. So what we're left with here are pooling equilibria. This figure just displays the equilibrium space for the principal. The agent, it's kind of trivial to talk about what the agent will do. In the retain all space, the agent prefers never to signal and is indifferent in the others. The x-axis is P, which is the probability both that a replacement will be competent, as well as the probability that a current agent is competent. And the y-axis C is the cost to removing an agent. And the thing to highlight from this graphic is just that the space for which it's optimal for the principal to fire at least one agent grows as P increases. And what's interesting about this, and kind of, I guess, nefarious, is just that agents are more likely to be fired by principals precisely when they're more likely to be competent. We'll observe this as a kind of a trend throughout the model. The silver lining here, as we move to after a good outcome, is that it is possible for agents to quote-unquote self-police or to tell the truth and help resolve the principal-agent problem. And so the graphic, this figure, is the same as before. The axes are the same as before, and it's just indicating that it still has to be sufficiently costless for the principal to act on a truthful signal. The equation at the bottom is the condition on the agent signaling truthfully, and all it basically means is that the agent has to care at least as much about having a competent colleague as the rent to obtaining the promotion. The idea here is that it could be the case that the superior M is competent, so what prevents L from signaling? Well, L has to prefer to hang on to that competent colleague rather than risk an incompetent colleague if she receives that promotion. But if any of these conditions are violated, we're back in the pooling equilibrium space. So as a gut check, it's good to note that the retain all space is larger than it was after a poor outcome because now the principal knows that at least one of the agents is competent. But still, for very high values of P, the axes are the same as before. It's still optimal for the agent to the principal to fire at least one agent. I think it's kind of interesting. So to begin thinking about validating this model, the next part of the paper starts to go through some empirics. And I'll just get to those briefly here at the end for the sake of time. At the top, I have a question about are personnel decisions strategic? So I think in addition to just validating the model, these empirics really add something to our discussions of how organizations assess personnel. So prior work has really looked at gender and race and these sorts of variables and haven't really considered how strategic these decisions may actually be. And so the first hypothesis is really just asking whether or not commanders consider the probability that a replacement will be competent. And so, and I have that quote from Eisenhower where he's lamenting in World War II about how, even really early on, the pool for competent replacements is very, very small. And so in the paper, I argue that the probability that a replacement will be competent in World War II is actually lower than in Korea. And the assumption here is that prior relevant combat command experience is what drives competency. So in World War II, many of these commanders had never seen combat, or if they had, actually were in a very, very different role. I'm talking about World War I. And so now they're in command of divisions, which is a very, very different role. Whereas in Korea, many of the division commanders had actually either commanded a division just a few years prior in World War II, or at the regimental level, just one level below. And so I make the case that the P is greater. And so the expectation then is that we should observe greater turnover in Korea than in World War II. And so I'll just go ahead and draw your attention to rows 3 and 4. And that's actually what we do observe. So I collected data on all division commanders in World War II in Korea. American, I should specify. And we do observe greater number of demotions in Korea than in World War II. And then when you cut the data and normalize by commanders, we actually observe an even more stark difference. And columns 2 and 4 here are trying to compare more similar combat outcomes, and when we do that, the difference is even greater. So I think there is some validity here, both in terms for the model, validating the model, and in terms of thinking about how personnel decisions are strategic. The second way to cut this is I do a comparison of 2 battles in the Korean War. And so we have a number of relevant commanders here. And so the first battle occurred really close to the Yalu River as UN forces were pushing close to China, and then China enters the war. And Edward Almond's unit, 10th Corps, is caught off guard and is severely beaten. And actually, during the battle, Almond actually went to Japan to confer with MacArthur about what to do, just very clearly at a loss about how to handle this situation. And ultimately had to be evacuated and shipped to South Korea, where he rejoined and joined the 8th Army under Walker. Coulter, on the other hand, towards the end of that Chinese offensive, was tasked with defending Seoul, and was actually told explicitly that he could, if he needed, retreat from Seoul, he ends up losing Soul. The difference here, again, is that Coulter is actually outnumbered in his battle, while Allman, in fact, outnumbered his attackers. But in the end, when all the dust is settled, Allman retains command, while Coulter does not. And it's even more interesting because Allman and Walker did not get along. There was a lot of animosity between the two, and I make the case in the paper that this occurs because of Allman's close ties to Douglas MacArthur, because Allman served as MacArthur's chief of staff, and MacArthur came to respect Allman. And so, as a result, if Walker had wanted to remove Allman, then that would have drawn the ire of MacArthur. So that's where the costs are coming in, from these personal networks. And so, moving forward, and as part of the larger project and research agenda here, I'm currently working on an extension of the model where I consider another signaler, and I'd be happy to talk about where that's going. It's really exploded, so advice there would be appreciated. I'm also considering an experiment, so really identifying the causal mechanism through experimentation, and then a couple of experimental tests. The first, where I build on previous work with Dr. Ritter, where I connect career outcomes to combat performance and leverage interwar variation and what sort of expectations should come from these sorts of statistical models. And then lastly, I've already started going through the cables of some of the high-ranking commanders, for example, Eisenhower, to observe signaling among the subordinates and under what conditions and what sort of informational problems these commanders are dealing with. And so thanks for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks a lot, William. And while William is unsharing his slides, there we go, then so I'd like to open it up for discussion. And again, if anyone has comments they'd like to start off, let's just raise a finger and we'll get going. All right, Toby.
Now, I guess I'll start off with some framing stuff, I think. I think the first thing that struck me is that I think there's a tension in the paper between your desire to pitch this to a really broad audience, which I think is good, and the contribution you'd like to highlight in terms of the military and military organization and promotions and decision making. And I think that comes through in a couple of different places, right? It comes through in the intro, where I think the first few paragraphs are very broad and general, but there's nothing in there that really drives a puzzle home that kind of hooks this thing in and tells me this is what's motivating the paper and this is why I should care. And so I wonder, and so you're starting off with this very general organizational structure, principal agent theory, and I think that's because you want to pitch this to a broad audience, but I think you can bring in one of these anecdotes from your case study that highlights one of these counterintuitive findings, right? We've got an incompetent general that's staying in power when we would expect him to get fired. Why is that? So I wonder if you can put a hook in there to motivate this a little better and drive home, and then the rest of the introduction can highlight the broader implications of this, and I think that would help you. The other place I see this tension is the lit review, where you've got this stuff about military innovations, where it just doesn't seem to fit, right? I think I know what you're talking about. You're trying to say there's lots of things that we think about when we think about effective militaries, but we're ignoring this how we select leaders part, but it just seems really out of place. Okay. And again, that comes to that again later on in the hypothesis section, where you talk about this this literature about how promotions happen and how we focus on promotions and not demotions. Again, that feels really out of place. I get why you're putting them in there, because you're trying to make this contribution clear to the stuff, but I think there may be a better way to do that in terms of restructuring this so that you don't have these big, long sections plugged into the paper at places where they just don't seem to fit very well.
Okay. I've got 2 fingers from Tricia, and then I'll have William respond.
Okay, yeah, William, I really was one of my major points was very similar to what Toby was saying. I agree about how you're pitching this, and one of the things that really jumped out at me is that rather than military innovation, I'm wondering if you want to try to tie this more into the literature on military effectiveness, which and then you could really, in the introduction, I think it would sell better that, why it's very clear why we care about military effectiveness. There's a literature about why democracies are more effective than non-democracies at promoting by competence versus loyalty. And I think that would, and maybe, putting that puzzle up front and that counterintuitive finding that you're more likely to fire commanders when they're actually competent. I think I mean that's a really interesting puzzle, and you may have some policy implications that you can draw out in the conclusion about what could be done about that. So I have other things to say about that, but that was my two-finger.
William?
Yeah. So framing is something I've been struggling with a lot on this. So I'm glad you bring it up and have those suggestions. And it did initially start out as purely in the military context, and then I started reading more broadly with the preparation for the prospectus and these sorts of things, and finding that these are just enormous problems. And so I think these are good suggestions about bringing in the counterintuitive things ahead of time, and maybe using that military example in the introduction to get more of a hook. And so I guess finding that balance is what I'm having trouble with, like how general, but then also I need to keep this. I love military stuff, so I really want to keep it in there. So yeah, so those are fantastic suggestions, and I like the suggestion too about not just military innovation, but also military effectiveness. And so that was actually in a baby draft of this paper. Did have things on military effectiveness, and in particular, I was thinking for a while about regime type, and so thinking about how some of these parameters might map onto particular characteristics of certain regimes or certain military structures. And so, for example, the psi parameter that captures the rents to being promoted, I was thinking, like, well, if we want to think about structures, I think Ryan Grauer is working on a manuscript about this, about how flatter structures may have higher values to promotion because you get more power over more people, or in authoritarian regimes, potentially where command authority is centralized in the higher echelons of the military, and so promotions closer to that locus of power would increase the value of psi. And then I kind of, that was initial in one of the earlier drafts, and then I backed off of that because when it comes to thinking about the context for testing this model, it may not want to be tied to particular interpretations, but I really like. So I'm really glad you mentioned the regime type as well, because that's something that I've thought about a little bit. So.
You can always hint at it as part of, there's another implication of this in the conclusion, right? So if you can't fit it in, you can always do it that way. I got June? Oh, wait, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. We can see you, but we can't hear you. And it doesn't look like your mic. You might want to try to mute and unmute your mic. Let's see. Still nothing. Crap.
I think I have a similar problem.
Still nothing. Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll get somebody to help June out. Idean.
Well, I want to start out by saying that I enjoyed reading this paper quite a bit. Having done a little bit of work in principal agent theory, I think this is a good way to think about this problem. But I do want to kind of talk about what kind of agency problem you're identifying. You sort of frame this as an issue of multiple principles, and there is a literature on multiple principles being able to serve as fire alarms on each other. I would refer you to the Kewitt and McCubbin's book. But when I think of multiple agents, I'm thinking of a situation in which the agents are formally independent of one another and performing some overlapping tasks. So, if I'm building a home, I might hire a plumber, a roofer, electrician, and there's not necessarily a chain of command or a chain of delegation. I think what you're identifying is a situation of a delegation chain rather than a situation of multiple agents. So you have the real principle, the five-star general, delegating down the chain of command. And one issue that I think you're going to have to grapple with when you translate this to the military sphere is that you're basically asking L to go over their immediate superior's head.
Right.
So report to not the proximate principle, but the ultimate principle. So you're going to have to think about that and how that works in a military organization, whether that's what types of commanders have that authority. It's looked down upon or frowned upon to to go over your superior's head. There might be consequences for doing that. But in general, there is a literature on these delegation chains. Nielsen and Tierney talk about this when they talk about the World Bank. So there is a literature that's out there that I think you can refer to, because basically, you know, in the language of fire alarms and police patrols, you know, the delegation chain is basically you're saying that someone farther down the organizational structure can serve as a fire alarm against someone who's a little bit above them in the structure. So I would sort of refer to, again, that literature, and then think about how this applies to the military and the military chain of command, and whether L has the authority or capability of going over their superior's head. Is essentially where you're going with that. I have some other points as well, but I'll let you respond to that and see if anyone else wants to chime in.
Yeah, great. So thanks for the suggestion on the literature. Oh, did someone, was there?
Yeah, Toby's got 2 fingers, and then we'll take William's response.
Yeah, I would add to that to just say that the other problem I see with that structure, in addition to what Idean pointed out about L's, and that's a salient problem in the military about L's ability to go over somebody's head, is that M, in my mind, has, if L is subordinate to M, then M has the ability to remove L from their position as well. And that's a source of information, right? If H is sitting there observing, trying to figure out who's competent, who's incompetent, then M's actions can tell them something. And I know that adds complexity to your model, and you sort of have M just kind of not doing much in the model. But I think that's an important point here, is that through this process, M could just remove L from command if they're incompetent. And that's missing information that H has to make their decision and could change the dynamics, or maybe not. But that's one thing I thought about in terms of those dynamics.
Yeah. Is there another?
Go ahead, Lynn.
So thanks for those suggestions. I'll definitely look into that literature. But I've also been reading up on how the signaling process works a bit. And for example, after the Battle of Kasserine Pass, Eisenhower's kind of reeling about what happened and doesn't really know who's to blame, if someone is to blame, and so actually tasks Omar Bradley to go solicit signals from division commanders about their corps commander, about Friedendahl. And so that's one way in which these dynamics are playing out. And so they certainly can look for other clear-cut cases of this, and so that's one reason I'm digging into the qualitative case studies, looking at the cables and how these people communicate with one another. And then going to the point about the role of M, so that's a good point. And actually, at a previous iteration of the model where I now allowed M to signal as opposed to remove, and that so we hit a lot of brick walls with that model because we ended up with thousands of equilibria we had to start ruling out. But this also, I think, gets to another point that I've been trying to grapple with this project is, how do I identify who empirically, who H is, who M is, who L is, and again, so having who has the command authority to then relieve a subordinate. And so that's one reason why in the empirical section of the paper, I focus at the division and corps level, because a lot of what I see is not corps commanders relieving division commanders, but rather army commanders and above who then have the authority to relieve corps and divisional commanders. At least that's the case that I've observed in World War II and Korea so far. So that's a very good. That's a very good point. So that's kind of what I have to say about that right now. So thank you.
So June is sending me her comments because we still can't hear her. So I will be her proxy. And but so she has a concern about the concept of the cost of firing agents, so especially as it connects between the theory and the empirics. So the cost of firing agent C seems to focus on the incompetent agent's personal tie to the commanders at a higher level in the case study, but that's not super clear in the formal model section. And so you might want to go into that concept in more detail in the theory section. And furthermore, that concept of the personal tie to a higher commander seems to be a narrow way of thinking about the cost of firing. So there's a lot of autocratic literature talking about autocratic leaders who try to keep soldiers who are incompetent but loyal precisely because they want to keep office, and so that there's a different sense of what the cost is. Is that good, June? Okay. And she also points out that that also leads to the question, what if the principal actually wants to keep loyalty but not competence?
Yeah. Okay. So that was a question that came up during my prospectus defense. It's a great question. So again, I think this goes back a little bit to, or maybe a lot, to thinking about regime types. And like you were mentioning, the autocratic regimes wanting to hang on to loyal officers. And so the way I responded to that was just saying that, yes, that's absolutely an interpretation of what C could be. I mean, in the dissertation, I'm also conceptualizing another measure of C could be that it's personalistic ties. So there's some, like a tiny strand of literature about everyone who goes to West Point, you know, they seem to like each other and do better in their careers, these sorts of things. So definitely, I mean, tying both C and that psi parameter we were talking about earlier into regime type could be a very interesting way to get at this empirically. So, yeah.
So is that how you're conceptualizing? Well, let me go ahead and get Idean rather than pontificating. But is that how you're conceptualizing C? And let's see what Idean has to say.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, you know, that June was kind of commenting on as well. I don't think this is C at all. This is not cost of firing, right? So in principal agent theory, we want agents that are most similar to us in terms of our preferences and would act as we would act in that situation. So personal ties, personal friendships, personal loyalties. If I know something, you know, deep about you, rather than you're just somebody I'm hiring for a task, then I'm more confident that you have my interests at heart, because you know we have similar preference. So the cost of firing, you know, I'm just not seeing it in the military command structure, right? So you have to show that there's a real tangible cost to the general for demoting somebody. You know, the personal ties, it's nice, but I think it's a signal of something else.
Okay. Is that any other twos?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess the way I was thinking about the cost of firing in the empirical section had more to do with the the principal's concern for their own career outcomes in the future. So the idea here is, I may not like this guy, so I'm Walker and I really hate Almond, but if I fire this person, then I'm going to incur a cost on myself because it's going to impinge on my future career prospects. And so thinking about it in light of combat outcomes, these sorts of things, like, well, I'm a general and what I want are competent commanders who will perform and implement the strategies that I'm most interested in. That's another interesting take. And you're right. I think it's a different type of cost. And one in which it's kind of interesting to look at in terms of, so if you were to interpret the cost of firing as maybe a lag in performance, which could be what these generals, these principals are more concerned with, then that actually does comport with some of the empirics that have collected on World War II, where we see during major drives, even when there's kind of a poor performance that pops up, it seems that commanders are reluctant to relieve that subordinate for fear, and the speculation from the model would be for fear of creating this lag where commanders really need to settle into command and learn how to, if they're a divisional commander, learn how their regiments operate with one another, maybe handle the immense staffing decisions that have to take place, these sorts of things. So I definitely am sympathetic to that view of what cost may be.
So I think what Idean is suggesting is that when we normally think about principal agent relationships, we don't think about there being such a cost, right? The only reason that you would fire somebody is so that you can get closer to somebody, you can hire somebody else that would then be closer to your policy preferences, right? That there's not this separate idea of an additional cost of firing somebody that would keep somebody who's a competent around. And so this is actually a really, really important part of your model. So you're suggesting that this cost is something that makes the military structure different from the way we normally think of principal-agent relationships? Is that something that is a correct characterization of what you're saying?
Yeah, so I guess it is I mean, it's a different conceptualization of what this cost is, but I don't know that it's inherent to the military structure. So that, this again is something I'm grappling with in the larger project about how generalizable this model is to other contexts. And I don't know that it's necessarily strictly military. And so, I mean, there has to be a clear hierarchy, so maybe it won't apply in areas that are just very networked, these sorts of things. Because what's driving this is the parameter is the to the promotion, and so the idea here is that the hierarchy is needed to drive that. And so, yes, I don't know if it's inherent to the military structure, but I see the point about how it's different from how this cost is, I guess, a slippage or whatever, is conceptualized differently in this paper. So.
June asks, how do you plan to measure the cost of this cost that you suggest in a large N study?
Yes, so I'm going to use network analysis, and the idea is so what I'm doing is I'm collecting the command histories of all division, corps, and armies in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And then what I'm doing is, once I have all of the commanders, I'm going to get their biographical data, their career data, and start drawing ties. So one thing I think is interesting about using a network analysis approach is that I can start looking at informal ties. So the fact that Allman served as MacArthur's chief of staff serves as an informal tie, despite the formal tie up through the chain of command. And so I think it's interesting in the military to compare the power of these informal networks. And what I'll do is I'll basically get eigenvector centrality values. And so the idea here is that I'm going to find these informal ties, and then I'm going to weight them by the rank of the tie. So the idea here is that if I have a tie to an army commander, for Walker, for example, it'll matter less and insulate me less than if it was a tie to a theater commander or overall commander. So that's how I'm thinking about measuring this particular type of cost.
Patricia?
Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is fairly innovative and somewhat interesting way of empirically testing this, but I think I would caution you about how much you invest in this particular hypothesis, because you know, the hypothesis that as the cost of firing a subordinate increases, the subordinate is less likely to be fired is just not, it's not counterintuitive. It isn't unique to your model. It's not, you know, I just don't know how much you want to invest in focusing on that hypothesis and testing that hypothesis. So I'm wondering if you could develop and think about testing some of the more interesting things that come out of the model. So, you know, particularly, you don't develop this as a hypothesis, but this idea that the military is less able to evaluate agents after a poor outcome, and I couldn't quite tell if that might mean that there are more commanders that are likely to get relieved of duty after a win than a loss. So and you can tell me whether that's, I don't know if that is clearly coming out of the model, but if so, that's incredibly interesting. And I wonder, you know, you look at battles, and so that's one way of doing it, but you could also look at wars, you know, and look at, you know, what was the rate of turnover after Gulf War I, which was this clear victory that everybody pointed to as overcoming the Vietnam syndrome and being this tremendous boost to the military. But it would be very interesting if what you found is that there was actually quite a bit of turnover after that type of incredible military victory. So that kind of thing, I think, would be interesting to develop. And not only is this hypothesis, to me, not the most interesting one, you're going down this path of testing that entirely with ties, network ties. Going back to what June and Idean were saying, is that really, that's not the only cost, clearly. Is it the most important cost? It just seems to take you in a direction that's going to be quite a bit of investment, but maybe not a great deal of payoff.
I've got 2 fingers from Idean.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Tricia's concern there, is that the 2 hypotheses as they are now are sort of the least interesting implications of the model. If I can fire you easily and there's a lot of people I can replace you with, you're going to be more likely to be fired. I mean, what employer doesn't know that, right? So I think the issue, especially if you're sticking with the military, is that chain of command and the ability to report up the chain of command. What kind of signals are sent, how the signals are sent, what kind of information won and lost battles send. Those are the more interesting implications of the model. And with an organization like the military, I'm going to just go out on a limb, and Toby can probably confirm or disconfirm that it's really hard to report over your superior's head, right? So under what conditions can someone lower down the delegation chain report directly to the ultimate principal? Those are the sort of the more interesting implications of the model. Not just saying if there's a big pool of replacements, you're more likely to be replaced. I mean, again, that's not what's interesting that's going on. You have a lot of other interesting implications here that I would urge you to focus on more concretely.
I've got 2 fingers from Toby and 2 fingers from June, and then we can get William.
And I don't want to pile on, but I'll just say that I had the exact same reaction about the hypothesis, that you've got this really nuanced, counterintuitive story, and you've got 2 hypotheses that are pretty straightforward, not counterintuitive, and maybe not the most interesting there. But I think it also affects the expectations of this thing in terms of the framing, because you read the introduction and you get this rich story, this nuanced story about signaling and about expectations and about counterintuitive findings, and then you get to the empirics and it's 2 very straightforward, non-counterintuitive. So in addition to there's much more interesting stuff you could do here, I think it also affects expectations in terms of once you get to the empirics. I think the reader's expecting something far different than what you give us in terms of the hypothesis and testing, and that can affect how people perceive the paper and its contribution and things like that. So, and Idean's right, in the military, going over someone's head is extremely taboo, and so, yes.
Toby knows. And then June's 2 fingers, she agrees also that H1 and H2 can be derived from a more simple decision-making theory without including self-policing or agents being able to signal things. If you go with personal tie concerns, then it's relatively common in the literature of autocracies and coup-proofing. So I wonder if you could say something specific about democracies, which is a lot different from the coup-proofing loyalty versus competency literature. And let's let you respond to all 4.
Okay, well, I think it's very telling that that's unanimous. Those are great reactions to have. And I agree. So I think it is true that we didn't really need a model to get here, and a lot of it was I'm still in the process of collecting data to try and test these more interesting hypotheses that come from the model. And so I guess the point earlier about the rate of turnover. So I don't know that it has like clear expectations about when it'll be greater, but I think it does have some expectations about when the turnover will lead to subsequent improvement. And so the idea is that it's more difficult to do, at least after a poor outcome than after a good outcome, these sorts of things. So yeah, so part of it is like trying to collect these metrics of performance and then linking turnover using this interwar variation to try and have expectations about when turnover will be effective at improving performance on a month-by-month basis. Yeah, this talk about whether or not when subordinates are able to signal really reminds me of the current season of Serial. I don't know if anyone's listening to that.
I was thinking about that too.
Yeah, so it's very difficult, and so I think one way that these episodes have influenced my thinking about this problem is that it also matters what your rank is within the military, whether or not you have access to these people who are and I guess Toby, you can tell me if this is resonating, but the idea, I mean, Serial, this was an enlisted guy who was trying to draw attention to, I think, a battalion commander, and so he felt like his only recourse to do that was to create this Dust 1. Whereas some of the communications in the Eisenhower cables especially, there's a lot of communication directly between Eisenhower and division commanders, Eisenhower Corps commanders, Eisenhower Army commanders, these sorts of things. But I mean, absolutely right. I take the point, Idean, that I really need to think about under what conditions will this even be a feasible mechanism through which principals can overcome any, like thinking of too about the cost. Like there's something, Toby, you mentioned, for example, that there's just a maybe a reputation cost for like, oh, this guy goes over his commander's head. You got to like watch out for this guy, things like that. And so one comment I've gotten before is having a parameter that just measures just a cost to signaling, regardless of whether or not M is removed. And that's something I'm definitely going to consider in future iterations of this model. And that would tie in potentially to some of Idean's suggestion about, well, it may be that everybody can signal all the time. It's just the cost of doing that, if you're a Bo Bergdahl, is really, really high. These sorts of things. And I really like the suggestion, June, from thinking about the coup-proofing stuff, but from like the democratic side. And what it made me think in particular was civil-military relations versus intra-military relations, and how they may differ by context or not differ by context. And so I guess in the civil-military context, it seems like loyalty would be more valued in an autocratic regime for coup-proofing purposes under certain circumstances than in a democracy, but maybe even militaries within a democracy. Within the military itself, loyalty matters a great deal, even within the democratic context. And so that would lend even more credence, I guess, to measuring this cost parameter by thinking about loyalty more so. Yeah, spitballing with that last idea, but I like it.
I think what I think that June and Idean's points are very related, if I'm hearing them correctly, which is that there are some cases in which this mechanism works and other cases in which it probably doesn't apply, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that means that you get to say something about each of those situations, right? Your model should allow you to be able to speak to the cases when this mechanism does apply and when it doesn't. So if you can think harder about those scope conditions, that'd be useful.
Yeah, that's great.
I've got 2 fingers from Patricia.
Yeah, just real quick, thinking about the military context, I think maybe another thing that's not terribly realistic is this idea, I think, that the agent is going to take the place, that's going to get the job of the, so you have a battalion commander that gets fired, that the soldier is going to replace the commander, and that, to me, I don't think that's how it works. You're just going to get somebody else, right? So that part may be something to think about as well.
Yes. Is there any 2 fingers? Okay. So that's one reason I'm exploring having multiple signalers, and so this idea of so I think in this iteration of the model, I just kind of wave my hand at it and say we could think about this parameters being weighted by the probability of receiving the promotion. But in future iterations, what I'm doing is thinking about how multiple signalers may change this dynamic, wherein we could have and this gets into the decision rule of the principal, which I think is something you're also hinting at, is maybe the principal could bring in somebody else entirely. And so that's something I want to consider more explicitly in the future. And so I appreciate that point.
Idean.
Hold on, let me turn my mic on. Okay. Kind of thinking outside the box a little bit for data, and just one suggestion. I don't know how easy it is to get, but have you considered looking at military court-martial data?
No.
There's a case where you actually would have military trials in which people are being removed, not just demoted, but being charged for, perhaps insubordination or failure to obey orders or war crimes, things of that sort. And then you would potentially have testimony from other commanders. If you want to stick with the multiple agent framework and not the delegation chain framework, you might have cases where you have lieutenants or captains or people at a tactical level rather than a big strategic level, sort of tattling on each other. And I'm just afraid that some of the high-level command stuff that you're looking at, some of those communications are private. They're done not in the public domain. They're sort of handshakes and personal connections, which is sort of indirect. Whereas with the court-martial proceedings, seeing who's testifying, what kind of evidence is presented, who's refusing to testify, and so on. Well, if you can, I don't know if you can. But that might be a source of data that's much richer than just looking at the network ties. Just spitballing there.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that idea. I hadn't thought about that. And getting the testimony, I think you're absolutely right. So that's something I'll definitely look into to see if it's possible to get information on that. I really appreciate that. And thinking, so I also appreciate the fact that you mentioned, lieutenant versus captain. Because I'm curious, and I've been looking for information on how those types of, because I know the promotion decisions are very, very different at the lower level, especially the 01, 02, 03, which are generally automatic, versus kind of the mid-level, the mid-grade officers. And so thinking through about what does that mean for demotions? Like, do even demotions happen in those cases? And so maybe I would have to go to the court-martial record in order to get at those levels more explicitly.
Right.
Yeah, Idean?
In particular, I think going down to the tactical level could be interesting, because when you're thinking about the big strategic level, you're talking about 1-star, 2-star generals, colonels, things of that sort. It's sort of hard for me to see how there's potential for hidden information. The MacArthur can see what units on the field are doing and whether or not they took this strategic location or so on. So it doesn't seem to be like a low information environment. A really low information environment is what's happening at the platoon level or one higher, right? So we're talking about very tactical decisions, and there's the sort of fog of war. And maybe the major or colonel or brigadier general sort of has much less information about what's going on in a specific operation in the theater than about, again, these big strategic level things that I'm sort of hard pressed to think that MacArthur wouldn't really be able to observe it directly. So again, just throwing out an idea.
Yeah, I guess one concern would be that I would have less information too about what sorts of things happen, but maybe what matters are the beliefs about what happened. But on the point about what divisions are doing, so I had this opportunity to go to the National Archives up at College Park and got to read some of these reports that were coming into higher level commanders. And they don't really contain a whole lot of information about why. And again, with the Kasserine Pass example, Eisenhower, it's very much true. So there's also a cable in here where, he's saying like, oh, we captured this objective, but I don't know what the casualties are. Like, I don't know. And he had a task Omar Bradley to go and basically take a straw poll about Freudendahl as a commander from lower-ranking subordinates. So yes, I do think there's they certainly have a better idea of what higher-level commanders are doing, but I think there's still some uncertainty there. But I definitely take your point about the tactical level. I think that stuff's fun to read too, so it's a win-win.
June's typing something, but while she's typing, does anyone else? Oh wait, here is the outcome of a combat. Does that depend on the principal strategy?
Yes. So that's part of leveraging the interwar variation. So in World War II, it was very much about, I guess it depends about strategy versus doctrine, all this stuff, but it mattered a lot about the territory captured or lost, whereas, and that mattered a lot initially in Korea as well, but then transitioned to more about loss exchange ratios, and then more notoriously in Vietnam about loss exchange ratios, and what this, how these met. So it's definitely true, and like Scott Gartner's stuff about having this dominant indicator, and how are these people evaluated, I think is definitely something that depends greatly on context. So yeah, absolutely.
We're getting close to wrapping up. Does anyone have any last comments that they'd like to raise or questions that they have for William? Okay. William, do you have any last thoughts for everybody?
Oh, let's just say thank you. I really appreciate it. Y'all taking the time. This has been a great opportunity, so thank you.
Yeah. So I want to thank everybody. I especially would like to thank William for sharing his research with us and the Peace Science Society in general. And congratulations on the major award. And this means that you're presenting it at the international one, right?
Yeah, I go to Milan next month, so I'm really pumped.
Yeah, it's gonna be great. You're gonna eat so much delicious pasta. But congratulations on the award, and thank you so much for sharing your research with us. If anybody who has tuned in late, you could go back to the beginning of this video and see William's presentation of this research, or you can go to the online Peace Science Colloquium website, which is a tab under the Peace Science Society's website, and you can view this video and you can download the paper and read it, and if you do, you should email William your comments as well. If you have comments after the fact, you can post them on the YouTube website or the Google Plus page, so that and hopefully William will check kind of regularly and see if anything shows up that's not trolling. And I would like to thank the discussants very much for taking the time to read this paper and to take part in this discussion with us. I think it was very useful and hopefully will help William as he works on his dissertation.
Yeah,
so thank you so much, and this is the last one for the semester, so you don't have to keep it on your calendars, but I will be sending a call for new papers for the fall series of the online colloquium, and so hopefully everyone will send their papers, and that should be in June or July, so keep an eye out for that. So thank you very much for everybody who's watching.